I knew I was gay when I was 4. And when I say that to people, they sort of look at me a little bit funny as if, like, how do you know that and why is that relevant to your life? But it actually is a pretty formative thing. And I found that most people know their sexual orientation or gender identity between the ages of 4 and 8. So I grew up in North Carolina. I interestingly moved around a lot. I had the opportunity to go to 9 different schools before I went to boarding school in Virginia. And that also taught me a lot as an only child who knew he was gay, to start over and to be able to connect with folks. And I ultimately went to college in North Carolina and came to Wall Street. And I started in Wall Street in 1998. And at that time, come on in. At that time, you could still be fired in all 50 states for being gay. There were no federal protections, and still there are very few for LGBTQ folks. And I was lucky enough to have some mentors and sponsors, and I started at an investment bank that was a British investment bank. And my second week on the job, my MD called the guy beside me a faggot. And I thought to myself, oh my God, like, I grew up in North Carolina, and I didn't have issues with growing up and being gay. My parents were supportive, my fraternity was supportive, and then I come to Wall Street and I have a homophobic boss. So I did what anybody in a homophobic environment does. I went back in the closet and I started looking for a new job. And the second investment bank that I interviewed with was called DeSilva & Phillips, very supportive folks, and I actually was very out in the interview. I was like, I'm gay and you need to know it. And they were like, dude, totally cool, don't stress. But I realized because I was in a homophobic environment, I was very focused on that. Once you've been discriminated against in your workplace, it's something that you are concerned about. But what that allowed me to do was start to connect my orientation to business. And over the 3.5 years I was there, it was a sell-side M&A shop. I was able to actually win business from gay and lesbian clients, CEOs, and media companies because I was out. Ultimately, 2001, I changed sides of the world and went into private banking at Merrill Lynch. And hi. And if you know how private banking works, they give you a phone, a desk, a computer, and they say, bring in $1 million a month at that time of new assets. And if after 8 months you don't have $8 million under management, you're fired. And at that time I was, I don't know, 25. And that was like 3 years ago, by the way. I'm 28 now. And so I put together a business plan because at that time in 2001, as I mentioned, there were not protections. There were actually over 1,049 rights at a federal level that gay and lesbian couples did not receive because marriage equality was not a reality here in the United States. 90% of those were financial. And I thought, well, as a financial services institution who's supposed to take care of your clients, wouldn't that be an interesting opportunity, right? Shouldn't that actually connect to a business? And so I pitched this guy, Brett Bernard, who was a guy from Atlanta, on that idea that that's what I should do. That's how I should build business. And he was like, cool, great, go. But if after 8 months you don't have $8 million, doesn't work, you're fired. At that time, the fail rate was 92%. 92% of financial advisors failed in the first 9 months. Luckily, I didn't. I brought in $100 million in the first 12 months. And after the first 4 years, I brought in almost $2 billion. What was exciting about that was, number one, I got to keep my job. That was definitely a bonus. But number two, I tracked that as a business. And so after that first 12 months, I got a meeting with the head of wealth management at Merrill Lynch at that time, a guy named Dan Sontag. And I said, look, I've done this in the last 12 months. I could do this across the country. We could actually win business from the gay and lesbian community, but we actually have to be good for the gay and lesbian community. We actually have to have the policies. We have to actually give back to the community. And at that time, Merrill had actually, when I started, Merrill had never sponsored a gay organization in history. I was the first openly gay financial advisor in the firm's 91-year history. And what was exciting about that was there were a lot of folks that actually came out to support me. And I love to tell this story just because it was kind of a fun one. There was a guy named Herb Rubin, who was one of the folks who'd been in the closet for his entire career at Merrill, 46 years. And he was retiring. And in his last year, I was one of the people he wanted to support by coming out. And Herb's claim to fame was that he actually was the guy who chose the bull for the Merrill Lynch logo. So can everybody picture the Merrill Lynch bull in your head? Well, the secret, Herb's little secret is that it's the gayest logo on Wall Street. So think about it for a second. If you can picture the bull, you can Google it, right? So there are 3 components to the gayest logo in history. 1, he's got a Chelsea boy chest. It's all worked out. 2, his little tail swishes up. Bulls' tails do not go up, they go down. And what does his front paw do? That was Herb Rubin's closeted little joke on Wall Street. So he was one of the folks that actually was very supportive of me, and as I mentioned over the years, we were able to track it as a business initiative. Ultimately, I was asked to head diversity strategy for Merrill, which I did, and then I was recruited away to Credit Suisse, and I was head of diversity for them, which was educational in lots of ways. In 2010, I got laid off, and I found myself on my sofa with a severance check and multiple martinis, and thought, what's next? And again, at that time, not just as it was when I started at Merrill, but the gay and lesbian community still had specific financial issues and also an opportunity for business to start to push change. I figured if I could get an old Irish Catholic company like Merrill Lynch to support gay rights as a business imperative, could I do it with other companies? And so I took my severance check and I started an organization I originally called Out on the Street. And I had 6 banks. I looked at Davos, World Economic Forum, and I thought if I could use that economic power to get CEOs and businesses to say that LGBT equality is actually a bottom line imperative and opportunity, could I actually make some change? And so our first summit was in March 2011. And as we've grown, well, actually after our first summit, 4 of the 6 CEOs who were a part of that summit, which was Bank of America, Barclays, Citi, Deutsche, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. The CEO of Deutsche Bank at the time was our first host. 4 of those 6 CEOs signed on to support marriage equality for New York State after that summit. And they all said that the reason was the conversation in that room, the conversation, the ability for them to understand how their economic power could actually drive progress. So as we've grown, I launched in Europe 11 years ago, and then we launched in Asia 10 years ago. We were the first gay summit ever in Asia. Then Sao Paulo, Brazil, then Sydney, Australia. And now Out Leadership is we're on 5 continents. We have almost 99 companies, 700 CEOs. We've built talent initiatives for young LGBT leaders, for women, for board leaders. We're actually the first B Corp in history that started as an LGBT organization. And so I wanted to sort of take that learning and share a couple of things with you that I've pondered on that I think would be helpful, and also what we're trying to do with this opportunity. So as everyone I think knows, post-COVID, and really the last 5 years, Black Lives Matter, all the different social movements, business actually is required to participate. There's a new reality. You can't operate a business in today's world and not have some sort of social purpose. I remember when I started out on the street and I was getting companies to come in and engage, it was a risk, right? CEOs speaking out on this issue, on any issue, was considered a social issue. We were able to get 370 companies to sign amicus briefs for marriage equality here in the United States, and companies literally had to rewrite bylaws. Bank of America's board actually had to do a board resolution to change the bylaws of the company to be able to sign the amicus brief because their bylaws said they couldn't engage in a social issue. And I remember Brian Moynihan, their CEO, saying to me, well, Todd, if we do this, that's Pandora's box, right? The gays are gonna come ask me for everything now. I'm like, no, of course we won't. And of course we have. But the opportunity for companies to actually participate, and it's not just an opportunity, I think it's now an obligation. There was a risk before to participating, now there's a risk not to participate. And people expect that, and it's not just on the LGBTQ issues. So the Out Leadership purpose, which is the organization that's the umbrella that I ended up creating, is to help business create a better world. And the idea that I took from a very small idea that we could get companies to leverage their economic power has become this global conversation. And I'm very proud of what we've been able to do around the business, talent, and equality framework. So I mentioned being a B Corp. If you don't know B Corps, it's for profit, for impact. We are not a nonprofit. And the idea is that we reinvest our profits in our mission, but we also support nonprofits by virtue of the economic engine that we were able to create. So these are the 99 companies that we now have that are members of Out Leadership. And what's exciting to me is that they're across all verticals, a lot of industries, and the companies that participate literally have to, I guess, really use that word, participate. It's not just putting your logo, it's not just writing us a check, it's actually doing something. And there's so many cool examples of what companies have actually done through our model and through our platform. I mentioned the nonprofits as well. The idea that you can collaborate and not compete in this space is really important to me, because there are so many organizations that are doing great work, and I want to be able to bring them all together. Whether it's in London with Stonewall, which is the organization there, or HRC, or Lambda Legal here in the United States, community business in Asia. The idea that we can use the platform that I've built with Out Leadership to create these conversations, and then these local organizations can continue to take that advocacy forward. On the talent front, there's actually the pillar and the opportunity for us to then develop talent to execute on this opportunity. So we have 3 pillars, or 3 talent development opportunities. One's called Out Next. I launched that 9 years ago because I looked around and I thought, all right, I've got CEOs and I've got business leaders. What is there for the next generation of LGBT talent in business? And there was nothing. And so I partnered with McKinsey, and Morgan Stanley helped us launch it. And Out Next is this platform to connect and develop young LGBTQ leaders. We have almost 9,000 leaders that have gone through this program all over the world. On the women's front, similarly, there are very few opportunities for women in the LGBTQ space to connect to each other. Most LGBTQ things tend to be male-dominated, and so the opportunity to create Out Women was something I was very excited about. We've had almost 70 of those events around the world. And then the final is called Quorum, and that's our board program. And I'll talk a little bit more about the advocacy that's been a part of that, but the idea that LGBTQ people should be included at the corporate board level. When I started, there were only 2 companies in the entire Fortune 500 that included LGBTQ people and the definition of board diversity. We've been able to get 27 multinationals to change their policies, but it's still fewer than 3% of the Fortune 1000 include LGBTQ people in the definition of board diversity. So there's this huge gap and this huge opportunity. But what I'm excited the most about is that we are taking this platform and we're using it to drive equality all over the world. So one of the ways that we're doing it is through research, and we've got QR codes that we can send out, and you can download some of this data, but there are a couple that I wanted to share with you in particular. One is our State Climate Business Index, and we rank all 50 US states, and I'll show you some of the data here in just a second. The board diversity piece, we actually did a mapping of the entire Fortune 1000 and the NASDAQ to map their board diversity policies. No one had ever done it, and my poor team had to do it by hand. We're literally downloading 10Qs and 10Ks and proxy statements because there's literally no data that we hadn't created ourselves to understand what the gaps are in that board policy. We wrote the first ever ally research. We had 5,000 respondents from 11 countries understanding how LGBTQ allies can actually be a force for good in business, but also to develop talent. And the trans piece in the United States is a major challenge. And if you haven't paid attention, please do. There are over 163 anti-trans bills in 31 state legislatures in the last 12 months in the United States. All of those are seeking to solve a problem that does not exist. Trans kids should exist. Trans kids should be able to use a bathroom that matches their gender identity, should be able to play a sport. Unfortunately, a lot of the folks on one side of the political conversation try to use LGBTQ people, and always have historically, as a political wedge, and this is no different. There are economic consequences to that, and that's one of my main missions, is to actually communicate that. So I mentioned this climate index. This is the 4th year that we've done it, and we rank all 50 US states on 20 publicly identifiable data points on everything from health access and safety to non-discrimination to schools. And interestingly, what gets measured actually does make a difference. So you can see we've got some states that are in the green that are doing well, and we've got some states that are not doing so well. And what I love about this year's index, and I'll just share with you, you might not even be able to read those. Number 1 was New York State for the 2nd year in a row. All the way down to the very bottom, South Carolina was the very worst. And what we try to do is literally not just measure these, but then rank them, and then help states understand how they can improve their rankings. This year, 5 states reached out to us after we published this on June 1st and said, we want to do better, which is really exciting, right? This is not about name and shame, but it literally is about having a ranking and having a conversation so that we can actually drive change. On the board diversity front, I mentioned the mapping that we did. There's a huge opportunity, and that's one of the things I like to speak about in groups like this that have a financial bent, for the companies that you work with and the investor community to drive this change. So you may have seen the NASDAQ had a board diversity ruling, I suppose. They added new language so that any NASDAQ-listed company had to have board diversity of 2 or more people of diverse background over the next 4 years. Out Leadership was the reason that LGBTQ was included in that. They used our data and our research, and we worked with the NASDAQ over the last 1.5 years for their SEC filing. We're doing that globally as well. We're working on the ASX in Australia. The new CEO of the London Stock Exchange, Julia Haggett, is a gay woman, and we're working with her on how the London Stock Exchange can do the same thing. And the opportunity for these exchanges and pension funds as well to broaden the definition of diversity is simply good business. So we were able to get New York City, New York State, CalPERS, and CalSTRS, for example, to add LGBTQ to the definition of board diversity for their investment mandates. Again, the opportunity for business to then drive change, supply and demand. If I can have this matter and be measured, then we can actually have more opportunity. From a policy perspective, any number of different areas that we're trying to work on. Again, in the United States, as I mentioned, these anti-trans bills, but there's a broader conversation around moving forward and moving backwards. It's one of the things I talk a lot about, especially as it relates to ESG, and that's kind of the final piece we'll talk about. But the opportunity for us to use these policies and use the platforms that companies have to drive change is pretty significant. Not just here in the United States, but globally. In 69, it was 70 until a week and a half ago, but in 69 countries around the world, it is still illegal to be gay. And folks don't really know that. I get a lot of surprised faces when I say that in public forums, but it's true. In all of those countries, our companies do business. And so my framework is, by virtue of being an economic engine in Uganda, Singapore, you name it, how can we then drive change? And I'll talk about Singapore in just a sec. But in terms of the opportunity, marriage equality, Ireland, Australia, a number of the wins in the last several years have been driven by the business community. Indonesia, anti-gay laws in India. And I really actually look at it as a global convergence. And if you think about how the world has changed in the last, not just 2 years, but really the last 10 years, I think all of these are converging. I think it's more about moving forward and moving backwards. And if you think about it as human rights, whether it's Black Lives Matter, or a woman's right to agency over her own body, or LGBTQ rights, it really is a human rights conversation, and it really is an opportunity for business. And so as we think about it, we're thinking about it more as what we call return on equality. That's been our tagline for the last 12 years. And we're building a new ESG strategy around that. Because every company on the planet pretty much now has an ESG strategy, but almost none of them have diversity and inclusion embedded into those strategies. And if they do, they generally don't have LGBTQ inclusive diversity and inclusion. And so we're launching this initiative this year into next year. And I want us to think about it differently, not just environmental, social, and governance as we have thought about it in the past. Right? When you say environment, people think climate change. Well, I want people to think about climate as much more broadly. Our LGBTQ business climate is one example of that, the climate in which people live and work. We know that, for example, the anti-gay states in the United States, 26% of LGBTQ people have left anti-gay states in the last 2 years. And 34% are considering leaving, and they're willing to give up 30% of their compensation to do so. So a state like Florida, for example, that's passing the Don't Say Gay bills and being bad for trans people, is literally sacrificing its economic future and its talent future to solve a problem that doesn't exist. And so the idea of this is looking at the climate for talent. There's also this idea of minority stress. If folks haven't heard about that, that's something I'm fascinated by. But it's the idea that there are bad economic health outcomes from discrimination. And there's a lot of literature that's been written and research around, for example, the African-American community in the United States having worse health outcomes because of the discrimination that they live under in certain states or in certain jurisdictions or in certain areas. And even from a broader climate change perspective, forced migration due to climate change. I think I saw in the Times this morning that a third of Pakistan is underwater from flooding, primarily the agrarian spots. There are specific challenges around forced migration due to climate change that impact minority communities much more than the broader majority communities. From a social perspective, I hope companies start to look at their responsibility as a purpose-driven organization. Every company on the planet doing business now has to have a purpose. It's not just enough to do business. You have to have a purpose for how you do business. And so the idea of the social piece, in my mind, is literally doing that. How can you tie your economic outcomes to the purpose that you have as a business in the world? I think the S piece of ESG is the thing that's been the most ethereal to people. It's the hardest for people to get their head around. But if you think about companies advocating for marriage equality, or for Black Lives Matter, or any number of challenges, that is where companies need to have, I think, a focus. And it's not easy. States in the United States are pushing back. 6 CEOs from banks told me in the last 2 months that they've gotten letters from states like Texas that said, if you push back on our anti-trans laws or our abortion laws, we will not do business with you. We won't do bond issues. We will literally cut you out of the economic engine of the state. And so companies literally are being forced into this conversation to make a decision. Right? Where are their values? And I was proud of the CEOs that we discussed it with because they all said, well, this is how, our employees matter and our talent matters, and we're not going to be bullied simply because this state has a different perspective. And then the model for corporate engagement. There are 3 areas that we talk about for corporate engagement. One's called the Win in Rome model, one's called the embassy model, and one's called the advocate model. And the Win in Rome model is literally you obey the laws and the jurisdictions in which you operate. The embassy model is that your employees are protected as long as they're within your 4 walls in a jurisdiction. And the advocate model is literally using your economic power to drive change as an advocate in the places you do business. And Singapore is a great example of that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the idea that this also has to be a model of how companies work in today's society and the world that we live in today. The last is board diversity and governance, and having LGBTQ inclusion and DEI baked in. And I mentioned the board piece of it and the policies, but it's much broader than the policies. All of these things have an opportunity for measurement. And if you tie it to a bottom line and you actually tie it to how companies look at what return actually means, then you can have this broader ESG strategy that has LGBTQ inclusive DEI embedded in it. So as we kind of go forward, I want to close with a quick story and an example. And then if there's excitement in the room for questions, we can do that. When I launched my first summit in Asia, it was co-hosted by the CEO of Barclays, Anthony Jenkins, and the CEO of HSBC, Stuart Gulliver. And it was hosted in Hong Kong. It was at the HSBC building, and if folks have been to Hong Kong, it's sort of the iconic Norman Foster design building. It's on the currency. It's kind of like the Empire State Building is here. People are very, very focused on it as an icon in the skyline. And at the end of the summit, we had a dinner for about 150 leaders in this building. Beautiful, fancy dinner, lots of clients, lots of politicos. And at the end of the dinner, the CEO of HSBC stood up and he actually came up on stage and he pointed to two screens. And he said, "We have a surprise for you." And on the screens was a video or a projection of the HSBC building outside, all lit up in red and white HSBC's colors. And they started playing Rihanna's song, "All of the Lights." I'm like, oh, it's a gay summit, we're playing Rihanna, cool. And the lights on the outside of the building went out. And there was this sort of collective gasp in the room. And 2 seconds later, the lights came back up, but they'd rewired the entire building into a giant rainbow. And they left that up in the Hong Kong skyline for 4 nights. And I later found out that it was the single largest press event HSBC had anywhere in the world that entire year. So it was this huge sort of message, and what's been fun is every year since, they not only light up their building, but so many other buildings in the Hong Kong skyline light up for the Out Leadership Summit in Asia. And if anybody has the Apple TV, they have the flyover screensaver. The screensaver of Hong Kong at night was taken during our summit. That's why all the buildings are rainbow. And while that's a really great story in my mind, what was cooler was that the next morning, Stuart Gulliver flew to Singapore. Well, Singapore, up until a week and a half ago, was still one of the 70 countries where it's illegal to be gay. But the day after Stuart Gulliver hosted the first gay summit in Asia, he flew to Singapore because he was chair of the Monetary Authority Board of Singapore. So he literally went from hosting the first gay summit into a country where gay people are illegal from a business financial perspective. And 19% of Singapore's GDP is financial services. And so my framework is if 19% of your GDP says that gay people shouldn't be illegal, maybe you'll start to pay attention. And over the last 12 years, we have continued to create that conversation. And I don't know if folks saw the news, but a week and a half ago, Singapore finally decriminalized. They finally did away with this old sodomy law 377A. And it was the business community that did that. And so as we go forward, my framework is how can the business community continue to use the economic power and platform that it has, whether it's through ESG or whether it's just simply by doing business, to continue to create change all around the world. So with that, we've got about 5 minutes if folks have questions. I'd love to know what you're thinking about in your companies, your businesses, anything I've said that's interesting that you'd like to know about. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think I would say we're probably pretty aligned on this stuff. So if you were pitching it to me, it's not really much of a pitch. It's a conversation. It's relatively straightforward. Maybe there are some things we could do, maybe there are not.
Yep.
Then I think there's kind of 2 other main groups. This is something I either don't believe in or it's a risk to my business.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the other kind of more neutral, I'm not sure what this means, is this going to be a distraction? And like, when I try to uphold and focused on doing what I think is for the greater good, you know, obviously it's very easy to find people like me, very easy to have that conversation. I also don't believe in like forced therapy or trying to drag a horse to water.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm kind of curious, I know certainly in your situation, you have some business cases to make. But how do you determine kind of where there's a business case or an ally? And in those other situations, like, how do you figure out if it's worth spending your time on, so to speak? Because I'm sure you would like to put a bug in everyone's ear, get 30 seconds of messaging across the entire world,
Mm-hmm.
and then go sit on the beach for a little bit. But like, presumably...
Do both at the same time. Yeah. Well, yeah, no, go ahead.
So I guess it's kind of around that, like, how do you prioritize the challenging ones, or like, you know, the ones where you have less, I'll call it ammunition to go on?
I'd say several things. I think one, you'll always have people that buy in immediately, right? And you'll have people that will never change their mind. So I focus on the folks that will buy in and the movable middle, right? There are always gonna be people that will never change their mind, and that's okay. I'd rather spend my time on that middle and the higher end. I also believe in economic consequences of discrimination. There's a great Peter Drucker quote that I love. In business, you don't have to change. Survival is optional. Yeah. Right? So there's data that proves that all of these things, I mean, LGBTQ inclusive companies outperform in the stock market. Companies that had better policies outperform more broadly. Inclusivity, like you could literally go through 1 billion business cases.
More productive, all of the...
Yeah, Rich Orlando's creative class, right? If you look at the ability of inclusive societies to drive innovation, it's no accident that the tech community started in San Francisco. Didn't happen in the middle of Texas, right? Like inclusive societies drive innovation and creativity. But people will either believe that or not, and that's okay. I look at it as, I try to take people where they are and bring them to where I want them to be. I grew up in the South. I was in a fraternity. We have 700 CEOs, and 96% of them are straight white guys, which is awesome. I think that's a huge opportunity. And having conversations, it doesn't have to be, in my mind, a Republican, Democrat, independent thing, right? It literally is, there's an economic case, and the human case, I think, is even more interesting, right? When I started, it was all about business, and you had to have the data, and now people have trans kids, and they're non-conforming kids, and gay kids. Like, the conversations become much more personal. But there'll always be people that will say, that's BS, that's this, pie in the sky.
No secret sauce to change people on the very opposite end of the spectrum, more of a just focus on the places you think you can win.
I mean, I think the secret sauce is connecting to what matters to people, right? What's in it for them, right? For some people, it's economic opportunity. For some people, it's discrimination. For some people, it's heartstrings. For some people, it's just doing good in the world. I think any of those things matter. But it's figuring out which one matters to the people that you want to change. Yeah, thanks for the question. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I know you work with a lot of nonprofits as well. Does your team have a dedicated group that deals specifically with legislation? Understanding both from the United States focus and the 70 other seems to kind of other country focus?
Yep.
Or do you rely on your partnerships with the nonprofits?
It's a great question. We're actually launching a government affairs initiative this fall. Literally because the state-based conversations are not being supported. And so many of our companies have reached out to say, help us understand what we can do in Kansas or Texas or North Carolina. Because all politics is local, and so much of the conversation does have to be focused in the states and bringing people along. So my framework is, can we create local conversations between business and government and make that case that, the Florida example of 26% of people leaving anti-gay states, that was kind of a cool thing about this index, that we had so many states reach out and say, hey, whatever those folks want to do discrimination, that's fine. There's Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman, was my first board member. And he used to always say, if you want to discriminate, that's cool, I'll take your talent. Right? It's the same kind of a thing. I'm not going to tell you your religion's wrong or your culture's wrong, but I will tell you that discrimination is going to cost you business. And that framework, I think, is how we're looking at it at a state level. We've got an announcement coming out in 3 weeks about that, so I'll just tease with that answer, but thank you. But that really is, I think, an important question and something that companies have to think about, because where they do business matters, and how they do business, where they do business, is something they've got to navigate.
Yeah, it seems in the ESG space, there's so many companies that will write applications, say they're on board or something. They're really looking for guidance. What are we doing? How do we do that? So
Yeah.
work as a consultancy.
Yeah, we do. Not a sort of little C consultancy. Like, it's not but absolutely, my whole framework is how can we be helpful to the company? So we have 17 pieces of research we've written in the last 4 years around self-ID, around all these other sort of pieces, so I can help companies be better. On the board diversity piece, we literally wrote the policy. And I was like, here you go. This is all you need to do. Please do this. I don't want it to be a mystery. I want people to do more and do better. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we have time for one more. Yes, sir. Hey, Mark. So the question was about Singapore and more companies that might be shifting, and I've got to wrap up here. Countries that are shifting like Singapore? It's interesting. Short answer, yes. And if you think about where companies are thinking of expanding, I think that's the best way to think about it. If you think about Indonesia, for example, Singapore decriminalized. And one of the interesting things that Singapore said for many years was that they were not decriminalizing because they wanted to keep foreign influence out. That was the framework. But ultimately, they want to compete with Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has same-sex spousal benefits now and visas as of 6 years ago. That was driven by the business community. And so, I think you can pick any number of countries that do still criminalize homosexuality and think of it as almost a wholesale. Most of them are the old British colonial, and the old British colonial laws, which are 377A. India is a great example. 4 years ago, decriminalized, and it was literally the business community that did that. IBM is just a great example. IBM had 12 people in their employee resource group in India, but when they did self-ID, they found that they had 1,000 employees. And they were able to actually go to the Indian government and say, that puts 1,000 employees at risk, this ridiculous old school law. So hopefully we'll have more and more states and countries that start to make that case. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining in the conversation. Out leadership, out leadership. Thank you very much.